When it comes to architecture, Boston has an uneasy relationship to the past. The city is full of structures that reflect our rich history, yet we're also known for demolishing whole neighborhoods in the name of urban improvement. In part 2 of our Focus Report, we look at whether Boston has learned from its past and is doing enough to protect and preserve our architectural gems. WGBH News' Adam Riley has more.
Just a few years ago, the Elva Kittredge House in Boston's Roxbury neighborhood was a mess, a decaying, dilapidated structure on the verge of being condemned. But now the Kittredge House is reborn.
There was a railing, but not much of one.
Kathy Kotaritas is the executive director of the nonprofit Historic Boston, which took ownership of the Kittredge House in 2011.
For the most part, that's been completely rebuilt.
After 3 years of fundraising and renovation, the extreme makeover of the Kittredge House was completed this summer. It's now a gleaming, majestic structure outside and in, and a local historical landmark.
It was one of the first houses to be built here after the American Revolution, when this was very much a rural area. So this house, if you look at the historic photographs, was a much bigger, sprawling estate on a large piece of land. It would have been a big deal to live up here.
The Kittredge House is just one example of Boston mobilizing to preserve its architectural heritage. In the so-called Innovation District, boxy new buildings like these have gotten most of the attention. But many businesses flocking to South Boston are choosing the Fort Point Channel Historic District, created in 2009 after years of lobbying by preservationists.
These are the original maple floors, 1905. We just resanded them all down.
Jim Kelleher is the CFO of Log Me In, a tech company that used to be in Woburn. He says that when the company moved into the city, the old school aesthetics of Fort Point's buildings were a major draw.
A big part of this building is the character of the building. So you see those metal doors down there. So we wanted to keep the character of the building and the character of the space, and we felt creating a high-tech space within that would be pretty cool.
That's the right way for businesses to think, according to Boston Preservation Alliance head Greg Gaylor.
Historic buildings are about new as well as old. They can be economic drivers, really, that they're very attractive to people for a whole host of reasons.
Now Gaylor wants more developers to embrace preservation as a commercial asset.
The character is what makes Boston unique, and the character of the city is one of Boston's most significant economic engines, and social engines, and cultural engines. It's not just here in Fort Point. There are areas in JP and Roxbury. They all have their special character, and if we start erasing those, Boston isn't Boston anymore.
Yet erasure remains a fact of life. With its Art Deco facade, the Shreve Crump and Low building on Boylston Street is one of the Back Bay's iconic structures. But an attempt to have it designated a Boston landmark failed, and now it's slated for demolition. And many preservationists fear for Boston's oft-reviled City Hall, which Mayor Marty Walsh suggested demolishing during his campaign last year.
City Hall is obviously a building that's difficult to discuss and to try to convince people that it's worthy of saving. But you have to remember that not too long ago, Victorian buildings that we love and adore were considered hideous and ugly and were torn down left and right.
Something to consider as we weigh which buildings should live and which ones can die. It's worth noting that Mayor Menino also called for City Hall to be torn down, and yet by the time he left office, most preservationists considered him an ally. Yeah. The people I've spoken with are pretty bullish on Mayor Walsh, too, who, among other things, has urged the federal government to continue this federal historic preservation tax credit. In preservation circles, that's a really big deal.
He did sign on to that.
He did, early on. Yep. He was the first East Coast big city mayor, yeah.
So why can't the Shreve Crump Low building get historic status?
The criteria are really squishy. I mean, to get landmark status, you have to show that a building has historic or aesthetic or architectural significance at some level. What significance means is up for debate. The advocates for that building took their case to the Boston Landmarks Commission, and the commission said, you didn't make your case.
All right, Adam, thanks for that. So what more needs to be done to protect Boston's historical landmarks? Mark Pasnick is an architect with the design firm Underover. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
This is so great to see. You know, those lofts and these buildings, so the integrity of the structure is there, but they're repurposing them. So rather than remodeling them, they're kind of repurposing them, but keeping the integrity of the building.
Sure, and I think preservation, it's important to understand, isn't just about returning back to the original state of a building maybe 100 or 200 years ago, but it's also about transforming and the possibility of reusing and giving a new life to a building. And I'd also mention that preservation is not just about 1900 and earlier. It's still an ongoing task for us. In particular, one of my areas of interest is in the mid-century and later works of architecture that are now nearing 50 years old and are also in need of protection. Many cases not liked as much.
Yes, like brutalism, which is Boston City Hall.
Which is the focus of a book I'm working on now.
You know, it's not just the building, because the building has its homely aspects, but I can see, you know, stepping back that, but it's everything around it. It's that horrible plaza. The interior of the building is so unwelcoming. I mean, what could be done to make this landmark? It could be, you know, really go on for centuries without being torn down.
Yeah, well, when Mayor Menino talked about tearing it down about maybe 7 or 8 years ago, a group of us put together proposals on how the building might be transformed and changed. And I think many in the preservation community are open to that. Boston City Hall is one of Boston's most important buildings. There's no doubt about that. It's an incredible work of architecture, but it's also 50 years old and has been actively neglected for many years. I think some investment in it, the mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics, for instance, is doing a number of small interventions into the building to try to make it better and more friendly. I think those are good things, but it also needs a bigger set of considerations. But I think a wrecking ball is the wrong decision. It's really a great building.
All right, we'll go along with you on that. Now, what about the Christian Science Monitor building, which I think most people on first glance would say is very attractive. I mean, it's stunning, and it's got you know, landscaping around it that is also really eye-catching. Is there something more that can be done?
So what's great about those two examples that you bring up is that they're both from the similar time period, both concrete, but one is quite successful. The Christian Science Center is widely liked, I think partly because of the pool. The reflecting pool is beautiful. It's a complex of old and new that comes together in a nice scale. And City Hall, of course, is really hurt by City Hall Plaza being very open and unfriendly and kind of windswept in many of the things. The city is looking at ways of improving City Hall Plaza. The preservation community actively worked with the owner of the Christian Science Center and the Landmarks Board to landmark that building. And now the complex is a landmarked complex as maybe one of the world's most important modern spaces that's successful. There's not many examples of modern spaces at that caliber that I think are as successful as that one.
Now, what about Government Service Center? That too is...
The Paul Rudolph building downtown, also another one. I'm actually working with DCAM, which is the owner of the building right now, on a studio with Wentworth Institute, Northeastern, and a number of other schools to study its future and how it might be transformed. But it too is widely disliked, but a very, very powerful.
Also?
It would be, yes, very, very heavily so.
I'd say.
But it's a remarkable building. It has what's interesting about this time period is it reflects real public investment in the city, and we don't do so much of that today. So many of these buildings are 50 years old, and they're not getting the same attention that they were lavished when they were built.
And some of the other buildings, these are big buildings, they're city and all that, but there's a lot of other buildings like those lofts, and the cost of property now has driven people to say it's cheaper to tear something down. So how do you get developers on board with, you know, preserving something and repurposing it?
Yeah, in some cases I think city initiatives are the best way to do that, or state initiatives. I think there's some inventive thinking going on. I think in some cases, for instance, the Ferdinand building is a great example of old and new being built together, that there's a restoration of the existing Ferdinand, and the school system is building a building around it. It's a really remarkable contemporary building. I think one of the best new buildings going up in Boston. It reflects a good sense of urban investment by our city again, something we haven't been doing in many years.
All right, Mark Pasnick, thanks for your expertise on that.
Great.